Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Angie Peacock, and I'm one of the subjects of the film Medicating Normal, but I also help with community outreach and some of the social media for the film. I'm also excited to bring you our first live interview with some of the wonderful people that we've met on the journey of making and screening the film. We currently release new videos on YouTube channel every Friday at noon Central Time, and we will be bringing you more interviews just like this one today. You can see our you can see our upcoming virtual screenings on our medicatingnormal.com/watch page, and you can see our events on our Facebook watch page. So this is our first guest. This is Karla Helbert. Karla is a licensed professional counselor, internationally certified yoga therapist, a registered yoga teacher, an award-winning author, Divine Sleep Yoga Nidra Guide, and a compassionate bereavement care provider, certified through the MISS Foundation of the Elizabeth Kubler-Ross Family Trust and the Center for Loss and Trauma. Counseling and supporting those living with traumatic grief and bereavement is the main focus of her work. Karla practices person-centered counseling, which can include mindfulness and meditation training, yoga-informed body and movement work, Reiki, aromatherapy, writing, journaling, and other modalities. Karla, thank you so much for joining us.
I'm really happy to be here. Thanks, Angie.
Yeah. So me and Karla just had like a really engaging conversation before we pressed live, and we want to continue in that spirit because I am not a reporter and I'm not going to like interview you like this is some, article. So I'm just going to ask a few questions just to get us started, and then we're going to go to the just go where the conversation takes us. And please, if you're in the audience, feel free to ask questions, and we have someone that's going to send me the questions so we can ask live. So for the first question, I just want to know about your work and how you approach clients with trauma, grief, and other, big, heavy emotion that's like traumatic,
So really, like most of my therapy practice is with people who've had traumatic grief. And so this means, you're grieving the death of a loved one who has died in traumatic ways, or you've also been involved with trauma that's connected to their death. I mean, there's multiple things that actually make traumatic grief traumatic. I mean, you could probably guess a lot what it is, like homicide, suicide, death, where your life is also threatened. Death after prolonged suffering and watching somebody you love go through a lot of suffering. The death of your child is always traumatic, regardless of how that person died or how old they were. And I see a lot of bereaved parents. I've been a therapist for a long time. The first part of my career, I worked with kids and adults with autism and other developmental disabilities, many of whom had also been through a lot of trauma. And then in 2006, my son died of a brain tumor, which just changes your whole life when something like this happens. And I didn't initially think, oh, I'm going to be a grief therapist. But what happened on my journey of trying to figure out how to deal with this and how I get through this, it just gradually like happened. And support groups are huge. As you mentioned, the MISS Foundation, I'm very active with the MISS Foundation, and Joanne Cacciatore, who's the founder of the MISS Foundation, and also really a premier researcher on traumatic grief and bereavement, has a training program that's for the compassionate bereavement care providers. And what we do basically is train not just therapists, but also psychiatrists, OBGYNs, funeral workers, first responders, anybody who comes in contact with people who are dealing with traumatic grief. And then and we talk about, how trauma impacts the brain and the nervous system, and then the grief that's overlaid or intermingled with that, and how you deal with it. And it's really interesting because we were saying earlier when we were talking off the live feed, when I watched the movie and I heard Dr. Veton talk about in her training space, it's almost exactly the stuff that I said, like talking about how post-traumatic stress is a real thing. It's not pathological, and neither is grief. Post-traumatic stress is an adaptive response. Like, it is your body trying to help you survive something that was horrific. It's the situation that is messed up. It's not you as a person who's experiencing, really, it's your nervous system responding to cues, either outside of you or inside of you. And understanding how that works is really empowering. So I teach my clients like what's happening inside your body and your brain. Here's why this is happening. How can you learn how to manage these responses instead of avoid, 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 which leads to a lot of problems. Experiential avoidance is huge. Like, you know, that often leads to drug abuse and all sorts of difficult things, anything we can do to avoid feeling that discomfort. Like when she also said that really our culture does not support this. Culture says, and the medical culture too, says there's something wrong with you if you're having these experiences, whether it's post-traumatic stress or it's grief or it's both of those things. Grief is not pathological either. It's a natural response. It's very difficult, but our culture doesn't give us room and space to have those feelings and experiences, because it's not just, oh, I'm sad. And there's no time limit either. And so I'm working with people who really, it's normal that you're experiencing intense grief and still potentially post-traumatic stress years after the event. But our culture and a medical culture says that's not normal and that that's pathology and you need to get fixed. And it's so heartbreaking to me, because not only is it, you know, not your fault that you're going through this response, but everybody around you says that you need to be better and you're not. It's really a blaming the victim situation.
Wow.
And then that ends up making the grieving person or the traumatized person feel ashamed of their response. And that emotion just leads to more isolation. And it's a vicious circle. And then, of course, like as the film addresses, what tends to happen is family, doctors, friends really end up sort of pushing people to get on meds. And then here you are stuck in another vicious cycle, or potentially you end up dead. And it's just that I'm so grateful for the film. It's just, I think everybody should see it. I wish all my clients would see it. And I hope that you'll make like other ones, like you'll have like more journeys, you know, it's like medicating normal 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6.
Yeah, right.
Where people can see, like there's so many, I mean, the stories that are depicted in this film, I've seen a lot of those themes, but there's also so many other stories, you know, and
we're making new ones because we have COVID happening right now. People
oh
are
my
losing,
God, so true.
people are losing their jobs. They're losing family members. They're watching loved ones die, and you know they're losing a job and our way of life, like a very social fabric of having community and seeing each other and being together. Yes. And just this morning I texted my friend and I said, can't wait to see you in South Carolina. I really need a hug, like just to have a hug. I haven't been touched in several months, you know. So all these things are changing in our society, and who's to say like you need to get over it now and get back to work and stop crying about your loved one. Like,
yeah, it's really sad. So you know, and therapists are we're really needed right now, and my schedule is totally full, and it's like every single day, every single session, I'm saying the same stuff over and over, you know, really just like validating people's experiences, that there's nothing wrong with you. You know, we human beings, and this is one of the things I talk about in dealing with grief too, we don't like chaos. And when you're in traumatic grief, and you could just talk about post-traumatic stress as well, when you combine them, like then you have like this double thing happening. It's the most chaotic time of your life. Like you don't know how you're going to feel from one second to the next. You don't know if you're going to walk into a new situation and suddenly be in the middle of a post-traumatic stress like situation where you're having a flashback, or you're having intrusive thoughts, or you're having a panic attack, which is really a fear response. Like it's a nervous system reaction. I really try to get those like words of like anxiety and panic out of my clients like vocabulary, and think about it as it's fear and stress. That's what it is. So those things are happening. We're in this world of uncertainty right now, and we don't like chaos. We don't like unpredictability. We don't like uncertainty. And all of those things are happening all around us right now with no end in sight. We don't know when it's going to be over. There's no way to say, well, in November it'll be better, because we don't know. In the spring it'll be better. We really don't know.
Right. And really from my own experience too, fear and anxiety, you know, I hate using that word too, but those things keep you alive. Like you are wired to survive. That is what our evolution has done. So if I'm afraid and anxious and always looking and like making, reading the news, I need to know all the information, I do it myself, then gives me this like false, sense of safety so that I can continue and like cook breakfast and take a shower today if I know what's going on in the world.
Right. And that's true. It's an adaptive response. That's why I've often said too, the reason that we're both sitting here is because our ancestors were scared to death. Like they were so afraid all the time, and it kept them alive. That's why we're here now. And that's okay. I mean, it's good. We can be grateful for those things that happen in our brain and our bodies, and also learn how to have some balance so that we can manage it better. It's true. We control pretty much nothing outside of our own behavioral choices.
Yeah.
And when you know that that's true, that's really scary.
Yeah. And so earlier you were saying stuff about post-traumatic stress, and it made me think about my own training as a therapist, that there was this one day, I just told this story the other day. There's this one day in class where they showed us, we were talking about post-traumatic stress and the DSM-5, and when it changes from acute stress disorder into post-traumatic stress disorder. And there was a chart on, he drew on the board, your natural recovery process should be about 6 weeks. And then after that, if you're still not better, then you have post-traumatic stress disorder. And then he did the same thing with grief. The bereavement clause from the DSM-5 was taken out. And so after 30 days, if you're still not over it, then you're really diseased. There's something like, this is wrong. So can you talk a little bit about like your natural healing process versus what is a disease or a disorder with these normal human things?
Well, I really don't think that grief is ever a disorder or a disease, and neither, in fact, like grief exists because love exists. When you, depending on the relationship, there are people who will die who you will miss and grieve for the rest of your life, and that's normal. Post-traumatic stress is a normal response to a traumatic event. It's not comfortable to live with that for a long period of time, and it can be certainly disruptive and really devastating to somebody's life. Trauma can be healed. That can be healed. I don't know what the timeline is for people. I know it's arbitrary in the DSM. They make it up. And just talking about the bereavement exclusion, in DSM-3, they gave you a year. They gave it to you. Before they would recommend diagnosing someone with major depressive disorder. Then in DSM-4 and the TR version too, you got 8 weeks. In this version, it literally does say, if after a week your client is still showing these symptoms, because it is true that if you look at the symptoms of depression and of grief, they're very similar. And a lot of times you need to be a really skilled person to tell the difference, but a week, you can diagnose somebody with major depressive disorder. And that's a major mental illness. And what is usually the first line treatment for that? Medicine. Yeah. And it's insulting. Like when you think about that, after a week, I'm not supposed to be having these symptoms. So even 30 days, that's ridiculous. And honestly, the research bears it out. Like when people have done research with traumatically bereaved people years after the event, they're still experiencing the things that the DSM is describing. Like for example, in the ICD-11, they talk about persistent complex grief syndrome or disorder. Like they changed the name a bunch of times. The main symptoms they look at are yearning for the deceased.
Wow.
And persistent thoughts of the deceased. All these different things that are really normal grief, and it says 6 months. 6 months. And I'm going to tell you, my son will have been dead 15 years come February, and that is the number one thing that I still experience, is that yearning for him. Not every second, but when I stop and I think about it, and I get close to those places which are sacred, that yearning is the number one thing I still experience. I can feel it like right here.
Yeah.
And there's still times where I have big sobbing fits over it, and that's normal. But again, if you look at the research and you look at people who've had these experiences, they all say, 10 years post the loss, they still experience sadness and tearfulness and yearning and pining and all these things. And if that's true of these large groups of people, how is that pathological? But what it does say, which I think is very interesting in those criteria, it says, according to the norms of the society, the religion, or what's the other one? The culture that the person's in. If that society or that religion or that culture says this is not normal, then they're outside normal.
Yeah.
Which means that those criteria are being defined by what's culturally acceptable.
Right.
And our culture is wrong.
Yeah.
It just is.
Yeah. And when you say, I always find when we say those reactions to trauma are normal, people feel like, no, you're not seeing my suffering.
Right.
You know, like, can you parse that out a little bit about what does it mean when your heart breaks because someone died and it being normal? What does that mean?
Well, you know, when I talk about these things with clients whose children have killed themselves, who've been, you know, killed by other people, who've had horrific death by cancer or accident or illness or all these different things, and we talk about how you're feeling, and then you look at how much love you have for that person, and we say things like, you know, every single tear that you've cried, they are worth every single tear. How can you not feel this way?
Yeah.
And even in grieving people, like even say 6 months in or 9 months in, they're still feeling all these, I mean, that's so early still in grief. When I talk about early grief, I mean like the immediate, you know, right in the acute grief, and then 6 months out, a year, 2, 3, 4, even 5 years can still be early grief. And some of that depends too on how the developmental process that somebody goes through in grieving, because it really is a developmental process. You grow with it. And when I talk about these things to people, it makes sense to them and it resonates with them. It's not what our culture says about it. So, you know, all of that is stifled everywhere else. Like, you're not allowed to have the feelings. In our culture, we're given like 3 months, I think, is like the maximum. If you're not doing better by, again, the standards of what culture says, then something's wrong. They think something's wrong.
Yeah.
I mean, I know people who 6 months grieving the death of their child, people have said to them, you're still sad about that? Seriously? And then you look at, you know, I know people whose children were killed in school shootings, horrific ways, and they're supposed to be better, whatever better means. 6 months, a year, like this is it. It resonates throughout your whole life. It changes who you are. Like, that's another piece of it. It changes who you are, and you're not the same person ever again. Right. I mean, you know this too from the trauma you went through. It changed you, and you were never the same person again.
No, and I don't think I'll ever. Yeah, I mean, that's the whole question of recovery. What does recovery mean? Does recovery?
I'm not down with that word
either. Does that mean I'll be healed forever and never, you know? No, I think that's unrealistic.
Well,
that I'll ever forget what happened to me or what I saw, right. Or that when I close my eyes at night, those images will not come across my, you know, not to mention the trauma that I experienced, like you're saying, when you have a real reaction to something normal, and then it's almost like a form of gaslighting that, you know, you need to be over it. Why aren't you over it? Get back to work, pull your bootstraps, and there's nothing wrong with you. You didn't see enough. I mean, there's shame and layers and guilt, and now I have to like unbrainwash myself that no, it's okay to be affected by something that was so intense and so real. And there, you know,
that too, that has to do with like taking your power back. There's a quote that I love, Walt Whitman's quote, that says, whatever insults my soul, I reject it. I mean, when you really think about something, if somebody says those things to you after you've been through the horrific hell you went through, and they just treat it like it's, you know, you should be better, and you can go inside and you can know what your truth is, and you can say, you know what, no, that's not my truth, and I don't have to subscribe to that truth.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. Oh my God.
Especially knowing that the DSM is literally made up. Like, it's made up. Just like Dr. Beaton said, there is no science in that book. None of it is based on science.
I did find that, knowing all that I know through this journey, when I went to social work school, I just graduated a year ago, but I remember sitting in the DSM-5 class. I forgot what did we call it? I can't remember what the name of the course, but I remember thinking, why is there no citations in this book? Like, every other textbook has citations. Why is there no citations in here?
I know.
That's a little shocking, even as a student learning that. Yeah.
It is shocking.
Yeah. Well, I want to say one thing because we have two good questions that just came in, and
Okay.
I apologize for not getting to them earlier, but we were having really good talk. So, okay, but I want to preface this by saying there has been an increase in antidepressant and benzodiazepine prescriptions, like 30 to 40% during this coronavirus time.
I'm sure.
So we are getting more and more people on medication. Okay, so the first question comment was, great topic. After losing my son, my doctor upped my Xanax dose quite a bit rather than dealing with the actual grief and loss. It took a long time to actually come to terms with it because my brain was consumed with the drugs that I was prescribed. Mm-hmm. So can you talk about when you go through something traumatic and maybe the rush to put you on something, how does that interfere with the healing process or not, or talk about that?
Well, in dealing with grief, so I mean, if you've already been on medicine, well, you know, anytime you're on antidepressants or benzos or a neuroleptic or, you know, anti-anxiolytic, whatever, it doesn't matter. If you're on a psychotropic medication, you never just want to just stop, because the most dangerous times are when you go on a medicine, when you come off a medicine, or when you change the dose. But I will, and I'm not a doctor, and I say this all the time, I am not a doctor. I do not have a medical degree. Mm-hmm. I know a lot about these medicines and about how they affect people. And I know a lot about the side effects and all of those things, but I'm not a doctor. But I talk to my clients about these things. And I have had conversations with doctors as well, who, you know, will write prescriptions for people. And I don't think it's okay, but I know one of the reasons they do it is because they don't have it. There's nothing else you can do. This is not fixable. And it's the power of the prescription pad. Like they can write, they've got somebody in pain and they have the ability to write this prescription and hand it over, and that person feels a little bit of hope maybe. Or also they put their trust in the medical establishment and this person sitting in front of them that's supposed to know more. And so they feel a little bit better and a little bit hopeful, and the doctor feels like they've done something to help. That's not a good reason to write these prescriptions. And I've even had, I think I told y'all when I talked to you and Nicole, we talked about this, and I had an OBGYN call me and say that she was sending somebody to me whose baby had died. And she was telling me about it because it's upsetting to her as well. And she's like, well, I just want you to know, like I wrote her a prescription for Zoloft and I gave her a prescription for Ativan. And I said, please stop doing that. It doesn't help the situation. You can't medicate grief. Well, you can't medicate normal, right? Like the movie says. Yeah. But what tends to happen if you don't have any really terrible side effects from it, so that's one thing, say you don't experience really difficult or dangerous side effects, but what is happening is it's numbing your brain, really. Like it disallows you from having the emotional experiences that normally should accompany this kind of loss. Like I'd said, like grief is normal. It's a natural response to the death of anybody you love. But you know, this questioner, the person who put the question, I'm so sorry to hear that your son died. Mm. Your response to that is a normal response. And that the doctor increased this dosage, I mean, of Xanax especially, like that's a whole nother topic, I guess, but it does a disservice because and I've seen this in my clients who've gone on antidepressants right after a traumatic event, a traumatic death happens, and then later they decide, I want to try to come off this medicine, and they come off of it, hopefully titrating very slowly and doing it in a smart way under the, you know, supervision of a doctor, and with support from me. But what invariably happens is when they start coming off of the chemicals that are really like blocking how their brain should be working the way their brain normally works, is then they have this huge, just like explosion of the grief that's just waiting for them. And I have a lot of clients too who are on medicine, and they'll say, you know, I can feel like I need to express something. I feel this inside me and I can't really get it out. I can't cry. I can't really, they feel like something is stuck and they're not having a natural reaction the way they feel they should be having.
Right.
And I forget where I read this. I'm trying to think that there was some, I'll have to look it up later. But one of the universal experiences of people being on SSRIs or antidepressants is this feeling of sort of having this veil between them and the world, that you're not really experiencing things the way you naturally would be. And that includes, I mean, so yes, this is part of the problem when we're talking about discomfort and how our culture says, well, if you're uncomfortable, then you shouldn't feel that way, because that's not normal. Normal is comfort and happiness. And if you don't feel comfortable and happy, there's something wrong and we need to get it fixed for you.
Mm-hmm.
That's not true. You cannot get through life without having sadness and pain. Most people can't anyway. If you live long enough and you love people, you're going to grieve their deaths. If you live long enough, you're going to encounter difficult situations, and you're going to be in fear. You're going to be in heartbreak. You're going to be in pain. You're going to be ill. You're going to have tragic things happen. And your responses to that is human. And instead of giving a pill, like figuring out how do we cope with those things, what are the things that help us actually get through those horrific events, or even not even horrific ones, but just like difficult ones. So we're doing such a disservice to people by not helping them figure out how especially for grief, integrating it into your being. Like anybody that I've worked with, and not just our children who have died, but people whose mothers have died, whose siblings have died, whose spouses have died, they know intuitively, this is not a thing I'm just going to get rid of. And when you talk about it, when I say stuff like, can you imagine a time when her birthday comes around, or Mother's Day comes around, or the holidays come and she's always missing from the table, or the death anniversary or your anniversary, can you imagine like not missing them, or not feeling sadness, or not experiencing grief? Can you imagine that ever happening? And the answer is always no.
Right. And that's really what you're hinting at, is like society is acting like you have to get over it quickly and don't ever think about them again. And that does a disservice to how much you love them while they were here.
That sounds crazy to me.
Yes. Yeah.
I mean, that's just abnormal.
Yeah. We have another comment. It says, my brother died in 2016 and I am so sedated that I haven't been able to grieve. Yeah, that happens a lot. I mean, even that's been my experience, and it's kind of seen in the film, where I was medicated immediately after multiple traumas in a row, including my own death imminent of a sickness that I had, and then combat on top of that, for those of you that haven't seen the film yet. But I was medicated immediately after. So kind of like what Karla is saying, after the medication, I came off of everything 15 years later. Then it's like, oh, the grief is still there. The pain is still there. And now I have to systematically go through it and do it my own way, because I'm rejecting that I need to do it the medication way.
Right. And it's like you feel like you're almost at day one.
Yeah, I started all over. And I always say it's like you kick the can down the road. It's still there.
You know? Yeah, exactly. And I'm sorry for the death of her brother too.
Yeah.
His brother. I'm not sure. Their brother.
Their brother.
Yeah, it's just, so I mean, we're not giving medical advice on this show, but I hope you've got good support, and I hope that there's somebody who can help you get through that so that you can start feeling your feelings.
Yeah. So I'm going to skip one of these questions and come back to it and save it for the end. But this one you kind of just touched on. So it says, you touched on how society often gets it wrong with grief. You're not over it yet. How do we get it right?
Well, I think education is a huge piece of that. Like, I call myself a grief activist, because an activist is a person who wants to educate or raise consciousness about something at a societal level. And that's really what I do with a lot of my work. I think it's what often happens is that the grieving person is put in this situation to address something with somebody who's getting it wrong. And that's really unfair. Like, this person it happened to me a lot in the beginning. Like, it's weird. Like, it doesn't happen to me as much now, because it's, you know, people who know me know my story, but I'm not outwardly actively grieving. So I'm sure a lot of people would think I'm over it by now. I mean, who knows? But what happens is, early on, you're faced with somebody who's doing it wrong, or they're saying the wrong things, or they're having some kind of expectation for you that is beyond what you can do, which makes good sense. You know, like, I know people who will get upset with a grieving person who's maybe like 3 weeks, like who knows how, like, let's say 3 months. If somebody you love dies in the summer and then somebody you really love died, really close to you, integral part of your life, and then holidays come around and you just cannot participate. Families who get upset about that, angry at the person, and then this leaves the grieving person to have to either try to explain why or educate or steer the family in some kind of way that helps them understand truly what's going on, or they isolate because they don't have the energy to do that and it's too painful. That's so unfair. And it is clear to me, so when my son died, the social media can be the devil and it can be all amazing.
Yeah.
Not the literal devil, but you know what I mean.
Yes.
Super problematic. So when my son died, there was not really social media. Well, there wasn't any social media. No Facebook, no Instagram, none of these things. And also, there wasn't all that much grief support. Now, there's so much more out there. And that's really just 15 years later, I can see a huge explosion really in how much our society has people who are bringing their stories out. And so that also has its, problematic sides too, because there's lots of people out there calling themselves grief coaches and all these things, and have no training of how to deal with trauma, or they're not professionally trained. They have their story, and I'm not dismissing that. That's really powerful. But I know I've had people who are clients of mine who kind of like go into other support group places and hear things that really aren't quite true about trauma or their healing process or whatever. So you have to be careful. It's like caveat emptor, like the buyer beware of what you're moving into. But at the same time, there's so much more support. There's so many more, online groups for people. There's so many places where you can go and be seen and tell your story and express yourself. And that's really good, because that wasn't true even 15 years ago. I was really lucky that I found the Miss Foundation, which did exist. And that's one of the best places. If you're listening to this and you are dealing with, well, not just even the death of a child, but because we have expanded a lot of our services and supports, go look up the Miss Foundation. It's MISS, and it's a nonprofit. And we have an online group. We have it's really great, and you can connect with people. It's one of the places that I went, because in grief, when you can share your story and you can hear other people's stories, one, you're not crazy. You're not the only one experiencing this. And sadly, not all therapists are trained in how to deal with grief or trauma, by the way. And that's part of what I do too. Like, I offer trainings for therapists on how to work with traumatic grief, because they don't know. And largely, not only with therapists and doctors, but the rest of culture, the issue is their intense discomfort with your pain. Yes. Because they can't do anything about it. And at the same time, you are a reminder that these things can happen. And it's scary. And I don't even think this is a conscious thing that people think about, but that's where it comes from. And nobody can fix what you're going through. And people want to fix it because they want you to be back to normal, and they want you to be happy again. They want you to be the same person they always knew. And it's not possible.
Yeah, when you were talking about that, it really, for me, I trained as a therapist for about 14 months and I decided not to get licensed. But what I noticed is that when people tell you that, like, you need to get over it, you need to forgive so-and-so, like, we need to have peace in the family, that's really a reflection of them being uncomfortable with that heavy emotion that you are bringing to them. It's right. Not a reflection of you not, healing quick enough. Right. So I think in general, as a society, we're just uncomfortable with dealing with emotion at all. Most people, even when I had clients, I noticed if you ask someone, how are you feeling right now? Like, the general person does not know how to, like, drop inside and feel around and be like, I don't know how I'm feeling right now. Like, most people have no idea. And until we become comfortable with being uncomfortable and feeling what's going on with us, I mean, we're going to continue on this path of medicate people, call a 1-800 number because I don't want to talk to you about it. Go seek support somewhere else. Go, there's all these things, these ways that we, what's the word? Like, get people with problems away from us. There's just a myriad of ways.
Yeah, well, it's its own little form of experiential avoidance, because you're avoiding your own discomfort. And then there's the platitude stuff. People say and they say that stuff too because of their own discomfort. Like, I think probably there's some things that people say that they really think are going to make you feel better or help you in the moment, but really it helps them feel better.
Yeah.
Because to say, to just say, I'm so sorry this happened to you, and to just then be with a person, that's really difficult to do.
It is. It is. Yeah.
And you're
So
right, Angie. I mean, it's true. Like people I work with, if I say them, how are you feeling? They don't know.
not most of us don't know. Sometimes I still don't even know, but okay, so we have a couple more about I'm going to speak to this because this is the prescribed harm community. So people that have, like me, you saw our stories in the film. There's 5 characters in the film, for those that haven't seen it yet, that had one level or another, medication experiences that they used for insomnia or for attention, or for me, it was trauma. And then the medication kind of like turned on them and they had to get off of it. And then they had to reevaluate their relationship to the mental health system. So through those processes, and people that are in the audience today that are typing comments, there's a grief that comes with, believing yourself mentally ill for 15 years.
Oh, I'm quite sure.
Or believing your mother to be mentally ill, and you watch her being carted off, and given ECT. And I mean, those are all these other traumas, these layers of when people seek help and the help does not help them, it actually hurts them.
Yeah.
And then you have to find out for yourself, wait, I went down the wrong path. I need to reclaim my own power, get myself back, and figure out how I'm going to come to terms with my own grief and trauma. There's people crying because this is a hard topic for our community in particular, just that many are harmed by therapists, many are harmed by mental health professionals, the prescribers. So I don't know, can you say any words about like grieving from what you thought was going to help and it didn't help?
No, that's a huge grief. And I think it brings with it too a lot of anger, a sense of betrayal, frustration. I would think that the anger and the betrayal are really big, and the grief piece, because then, you're left with more losses. But I think that anger and betrayal, I mean, I feel angry and betrayed when I hear these stories. And I have people come to me, somebody who was in a support group meeting with me just this past month whose son was killed, was shot to death, has been to 3 different therapists, and still hasn't found somebody who will hear their story. And I didn't go into detail with them about exactly what but I've heard when people come to me after having gone to multiple therapists, that therapists can do so much harm. There's a lot of good therapists out there, but and again, like it's so sad, and it's tragic in its own way, because we are all socialized and trained to believe that the medical professionals know best, and they often do not. And it's really frustrating to me how I know what I know about these drugs, but it seems like prescribers don't know. I don't understand. I still don't understand that. I don't really get it. Like, did they just not read the stuff, or they? And I do think that's true for some part of that population of people. I think they avoid like movies like yours, but it can't be all of them. And I still don't understand it. So, and I haven't had that kind of harm done to me. So I can imagine that people who have had that, how you must feel. And I'm so sorry for the pain of people who've been hurt by therapists. I mean, that feels real personal to me. And I will say, like when my son died, all my friends and my therapist friends were all like, should you see a therapist? I didn't want to see a therapist because I was afraid that if I went into a therapist's office and they tried to dismiss my grief or talk to me about stages or tell me to get over it, I knew I would be furious because I was real angry for a couple of years.
Yeah.
Maybe longer. And I just didn't want that. I knew that would be more harmful to me. And so what I did is I sought out support groups, and I did a lot of art making and a lot of writing and a lot of expressive stuff that I just felt. And that's what I do in my work a lot with people too, is you have to find a way to express this, move it through you. Your feelings are meant to move, and that piece of it. But again, like it's about education. And I think the more the word gets out, like with Medicating Normal and with ISEP, which is how y'all found me on that provider list, so the International Society for the Ethical Practice of Psychiatry and Psychology, people who are there, and I know there's support groups for people who've had harm from medication too, there's resources for them there as well. I think the more those sorts of resources and places grow, then the more education will happen. I think that's slow. And especially when you consider, like, as you said, like the rate of prescribing that's going on right now, and the fatter and fatter and fatter that the DSM keeps getting, it's really hard and it's daunting. And I hope that everyone who's had this kind of harm from polypharmacy or from providers who have been callous or who didn't care, who are practicing without appropriate training. A lot of therapists do not have training in traumatic grief. Like, I'm part of communities of therapists, local and otherwise, where I'm often afraid to refer people if I don't have space. And that doesn't mean I'm the best therapist in the world. It doesn't mean that. I know I'm not the only person that can help people. I'm not for everybody. That's another thing. But I don't want to send anybody who's vulnerable and desperate and in abject pain to somebody who's untrained, who could cause them further harm. And so I'm like, okay, you work with grief. Tell me your credentials. They have a weekend training or something. I mean, I've read a book. Grief is not seen as some, like, in a lot of ways, it's like you take a workshop and then you're qualified to work with it, and it's not true. I mean, not only have I had my own experience, but I've had hundreds of hours of training and hundreds of hours of work and research and reading. And I train other people now, and that's one of the reasons why, because I want to know who I can send people to when I need to send somebody. I want to know that this therapist has the correct information. And, it's astounding to me that, I don't know right now, but I know that the program I went to, I'll have to go check, that my graduate program didn't have a required trauma course. It should be required. Yeah, and I think that's true of most programs. There's not a required trauma course.
No. And in fact, I think one of my professors kind of mocked the whole trauma thing. Like, well, nowadays everybody has trauma, and there's like little trauma and there's big trauma. That was
a lot of people have had trauma.
Yeah, this is a traumatic country that we live in,
A lot of people have had a lot of trauma. I mean, there's a job I do on once a week. I work with a mental health support services organization, and I do assessments and stuff and determine, whether they're eligible for services, whatever. And they come in and they have a long list of all sorts of diagnoses: schizophrenia, depression, bipolar, all these things. And when they start talking to me, there's trauma after trauma after trauma after trauma in their history that nobody has heard.
No.
They've not witnessed their story. They've not been able to tell that story. And, there's just so much of that. And the therapists aren't trained to see it and to assess for it and to treat trauma.
Yeah. Well, and I think it goes back to what we were saying earlier about my ability. Well, there's two things I'm thinking of. One, Irving Yalom, his book, The Gift of Therapy, was required reading in one of my classes. And this is kind of controversial. This was like a heated discussion in our class. But one of the things that he says is, like, you cannot take your client if you have not gone that far. Like, unless you have been in the depths of suffering, how do you know what it's like for someone that's in the middle of it? I mean, that's a good question. I mean, I don't know if that's true or not. Some people are able to hold space for others when maybe they haven't experienced, like, the death of a child or something. But also, from my training, I noticed that just being a good listener is a skill. Like, are you able to hold the space for someone that is having this intense experience? And like you said, to let them share their story without you trying to butt in and tell them how to fix it and how to get over it, because that's about you. But like, how to just sit there and listen and hold that space and give that person the whole hour. I mean, it's a shame we only have an hour, but to let them go through their own healing process and to be witness of that. To me, that's a sacred thing. Like, I saw that as a sacred, like, wow, somebody trusts me enough to witness their healing process. To me, therapy is a sacred thing. And when there's harm done, that's like sacrilegious,
Absolutely.
But yeah.
Well, that's the first thing, is do no harm. But yeah, I love Irving Yalom. He's awesome. But I don't know. There's a time when I 100% would have agreed with that. In fact, that's what I felt. In the beginning. I looked for a therapist that had a kid die, and I couldn't find one. And I thought, they can't understand. And I know that's not true now. I know people who are really good at working with bereaved parents who have not experienced the death of a child. I know people who haven't even had a child who are amazing with bereaved parents. Really, it's about learning to be comfortable in your own discomfort. That's what it's about. I mean, this is another part of what I teach too, is like learning the mindfulness skills. But a therapist having their own practice
Mm-hmm.
of being quiet and being able to allow their own feelings and experiences. Everybody's been through something. You know, and if you're not able to be with your own pain, I do think for sure that nobody has any business being a therapist if they're not dealing with their own stuff. It doesn't mean you've had to have the same kind of trauma that I've had. I mean, I was never in the military, and I could listen to your story and absolutely empathize with what you went through.
Right.
You could listen to my story, I'm quite sure.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't really think that's true. I do think that, though, it means you need to be able to be in the suffering with somebody. Like Robert Stollerow calls it dwelling with the other, emotional dwelling.
Yeah.
That you're not just like sitting there, you're dwelling in a space with them. You're
Yes.
being in this place with them, supporting them, and like you said, holding that space. I mean, it is a sacred thing.
Yeah.
And when that sanctity is broken, it is really a horrible thing.
And
It is.
and, and what
It is sacrilegious.
yeah, and even like you said earlier about being vulnerable and desperate and having just suffered a traumatic grief, it's so important that you have someone that is able to do that with you and doesn't. And I'm listen, I love therapists. I have a therapy appointment tomorrow, so I'm not beyond that by any means, but
Oh,
sometimes I think we shouldn't professionalize help. We should be able to be this for each other. Like I should have, or listen to me with all the shoulds, but have a friend that can sit there with me when I'm having a grieving moment or whatever. So we all need to learn the skill. It's not just go to a therapist
oh, well, totally. Well, I think sometimes that whole you need to go to a therapist is a way that whoever says it is avoiding their own discomfort.
true,
Send you to a professional who's supposed to know how to deal with you
true.
and fix you.
Yeah, exactly. So I think we're about to 12 minutes left. So I'm going to move to the next theme. I hope this person's still here, but they were saying, so if medicine, pills, and the doctor aren't the answer for grief, and it goes on and on and on for years, or even forever in some people, is the solution to manage it then, to learn to live with it? And if so, how?
Well, so I mentioned a little bit earlier this whole idea of developmental process in grief, and it's that's really a piece. That's really what it is. Like you learn. So I'll tell this little story that I really like to tell about healing. And I know about when it was because I had started my private practice, and so that was 6 years after the death of my son. And I was pretty functional. I mean, you can be really functional and be really grieving at the same time. Like it's learning how to manage and I would wonder where this, like if this person who wrote that comment or in question, like where they are in their grief process. And time itself doesn't really do anything. It's really what you do with that time that matters. But still being like a functional person, I mean, growing my business and starting a private practice, I had another child at that point, dealing with all of that stuff didn't mean I still wasn't grieving. And I had at that point written a lot about healing and talked a lot about healing. And I was in my office looking out the window at a tree. Doesn't really do anything. It's really what you do at that time. I was looking at the tree and thinking about growth and the tree growing. And I just thought, what if this grief thing is not really a healing process? What if it's a growth process and a learning process? And I know that I want to be growing and learning the rest of my life. And at that moment, I just felt like, what if I just don't have to heal from this? And it was like a weight was lifted off my shoulders because I'm never going to heal from my son being no longer part of our lives, from all the stuff we went through. And see, I can still cry about it. Like it's every day I miss him. And so it's not about getting rid of grief. It's about learning how to hold it. It's about integrating it into your life. And it's nothing that you chose. Like I didn't choose this. This is not what I thought my life. This is not the plan that I had. Mm-hmm. And so often with grief and trauma, that's not the plan you had. And then you have to figure out, okay, what's the new plan? and learning how to be with that grief. And, you know, the early on stages are in tending to yourself. Self-compassion and self-care are huge, huge. And it's really difficult to do because you don't care about yourself often in that kind of grief. It's overwhelming. A lot of times people don't even want to be here. You wake up the next morning, every morning you wake up and this is still happening. It's still your life and it sucks. So it's about getting support. The people who do better, who have like the best outcomes in the long run, are people who have good self-care and good support. And these are really important. Finding a non-judgmental people to listen to your story. Finding, like I said before, ways of expressing and moving your feelings through. All those feelings are valid. Finding a way, like another thing that I say is that I think that grieving people have two major things we have to do. And one of them is figuring out how you have a relationship with somebody who's not here, because you don't stop having a relationship. And that relationship also grows and develops. Is it what I want? No. I wish I had an almost 16-year-old boy here. It's really hard for me to even imagine. Like, I don't know, what would he be like? Who would he be? And those questions are constant. I mean, not with every thought I have, but they're always there.
That makes me tear up just thinking, you know, that loss. Yeah.
It sucks.
Yeah.
And my daughter doesn't make up for his absence.
Right.
She's her own person and she's awesome too. I'm always missing him. And so how does that then become part of our lives? So that figuring out how you have a relationship with somebody who's not here, and the other side of it is figuring out who you are now that this has happened, because you're not the same. And there's a lot of like secondary losses in that too. Yeah. And that shifts around. Like a lot of who I was and thought I was is changed, but then a lot of me is back again. You know, this affects you on every level of being: physical, mental, cognitive, emotional, energetic, spiritual, all these things. And nobody tells you this. Mm-hmm. And then it just happens. And it's like a nuclear bomb exploded inside of you and inside of a family, come to that. Like, it is so, and it's such a stressful event. It's a lot. And so, yes, like finding somebody, whether it's a therapist or whether it's a clergy person you trust, or somebody you can have, whether it's a bunch of support group people who really hear you and can hold your space and story with you, finding those people and opening yourself up to your feelings, because even though it is searing and it is painful, it's excruciating, every time you can sit with those feelings, and it's never the same every single time. If you can be with it and not avoid your feelings, you can see they'll show up and it'll be a lot. And then they eventually start to shift and move. Like, you can't lay on the floor and cry forever. Eventually the tears dry up, you have a headache, your eyes are swollen, you can't breathe, but you got to get up and, I don't know, wash the dishes or go for a walk or take a deep breath. I mean, for me, I also found yoga was hugely helpful. I mean, we didn't even get into that, and I didn't even know it for the first few years because I was like mad at yoga. That didn't help me either. But looking back, it did, because I was still trying to meditate. I still had to consciously practice breathing because it stops your breath. It's so intense.
Yes.
So finding the ways that help you get through each moment. And as I tell a lot of people I work with, sometimes it really is getting through this breath. It's not going to be that way forever. I remember, like, early on, I don't know, in the first year somewhere, some people in a support group that I was part of, it was like the 10th anniversary of her child's death. And I remember thinking, oh my God, 10 years? That seemed unreal to me. Like, I couldn't even think about the next day. And then here I am, 15 years. And eventually, if I'm still alive, it'll be 30. I mean, I was just thinking about this the other day, like literally like 2 or 3 days ago. On his birthday, he will be 16. He'd be driving a car. Like, and the thought of that like blew my mind. I was like, oh my God.
Yeah.
Like, that's part of my life. And like learning how to hold it. And another good analogy is like lifting a weight. If you've never lifted weights before and you go to a gym and you try to pick up and curl like a 30-pound dumbbell, you're not going to be able to do that more than once even that, right? But if you pick it up every day and you do it every day, eventually it's easier to carry, and you can be like, okay, well, I can just carry this across the room. I can carry it where I need to carry it. I can put it in a bag and take it with me. The weight of the thing does not change, but you change. And I don't even want to talk about being stronger. You learn how to adapt to this as part of your life.
Wow, that's really good. That's
And
really
hopefully sometimes you can sit the weight down for a little while, but eventually you got to pick it back up again because it's yours.
yeah. And that there's no like quick fix for that. Like the
No.
weight is going to be there whether you're medicated or not medicated. Yeah. Wow.
Yes, and in fact, like I really think, medicating, trying to medicate grief just makes the weight even heavier eventually.
Mm.
Whatever somebody's expectations are around what they think that medicine's doing, it does not take away the grief.
Yeah.
And in fact, it makes it harder to be able to balance it and manage it. And I'm not saying stop taking your medicine if you're taking medicine. Do not do that, please. But like educate yourself around it.
Yeah.
And learn that what would it mean if I wasn't on this? What would it be like? What can I expect if I try to come off of it and get with a provider who can help you come off of it safely? That's it. But it's not going to fix the grief.
Yeah. So we'll be wrapping up now, and there's just a few comments. A couple of people said, I have no questions, but I just want to say a big thank you to Karla and Angie. Great job. Thank you so much. I took a lot away from this. This has been incredibly helpful. So I just wanted you to know that before we sign off. Do you want to tell people how they can find you and how they can find about like Miss Foundation?
Well, the Miss Foundation's website is missfoundation.org. That's where they are. And my website is just my name. It's Karla Helbert. It's Karla with a K, Helbert, HELBERT.com. That's my website. And I'm actually, I don't know if you're interested, next month, I'm actually doing a 2-day grief and yoga for grief and loss workshop for a really awesome nonprofit here called Project Yoga Richmond.
Nice.
That's happening November 14th and 15th. And
is it virtual or in person?
Yeah, it's through Zoom.
Nice.
So which it has its drawbacks, but also if it's on Zoom, like somebody across the country can also join, which that couldn't happen if it was in person. So that's nice. So that's that could be accessible maybe for some people. And if you say, oh, I can't do yoga, because a lot of people say that, there'll be some movement, but it's very, very gentle. There's going to be some philosophy, meditation, breathing, really sort of practical things that you can do. I'm not like a superpower yoga kind of person. So
good. Yeah.
Yeah. And so hopefully, I mean, if you're interested, you can join me there. I know they have a couple scholarships available for people and the registration is through them. But if you go to my website, you can sign up for my newsletter. And I think information about that's coming out Wednesday of this week, and how to register and how to find more information for that particular workshop. But
nice.
Just in general, if you just want to read some stuff I've written, there's information about my books that I've written on my website, and a bunch of articles and stuff on there too.
She's so humble because I love your website. Last night I saw this quote. I should probably end with it. I saw this quote on your website. Question: how do you carry a grief that seems larger than the world? Answer: we carry it with a really strong container. I thought that was beautiful that I read last night.
Yeah, so a lot of the workshops I do are based on that, strengthening your container, because it's true. Like you can't carry a grief like that and trauma like that in a weak container. And it's not just about your physical body. It's about your emotional body, your mental body, your energetic body, all of the layers of who we are, all of which are deeply impacted by grief and trauma. Mm-hmm. And when it first happens, like you're like coming back to the developmental stage thing, you're like a little baby. You can't hold that, it's like you're floored.
Well, and it's so traumatic and like a shock to your system,
And it's a long process. And that's where the whole idea of what our culture says should be the norm and what really is the truth of the situation are so disparate. Like they don't match up at all.
Wow. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for joining us. This was wonderful. This was healing even for me, just to hear you.
Angie, I'm so happy that I got in touch with y'all and y'all found me.
It was wonderful. So I'm just going to say some quick announcements at the end, that we have another conversation just like this one, but Nicole is going to interview Dr. Michael Bohan, and it's about the topic of anti-anxiety medication, and that'll be on October 7th at 12 noon Central. And we'll be adding more interviews soon. And if you haven't seen the film yet, please go to our website, medicatingnormal.com/watch, and you can see the upcoming, the ones that are upcoming. So thank you so much for joining us. Thank you to the audience. Thank you, Karla. This was wonderful. And
Thank you.
I just hope it brought a little piece to everyone watching.
Me
Have
too.
a great week.